Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conversation with Professor Carole Cusack. We are so delighted to have you here, especially so late in the day in Australia. Carole is Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Sydney and is an expert on a number of themes, including invented religions and pilgrimage, as well as a historian going much further back. But we're just delighted to have you here, Carole, and to learn a little bit from your work. So thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
So, Carole, not everyone decides one day to go and study religion. What drew you to religion? Are you particularly religious yourself? Were you raised in a religious home? What kind of drew you to this subject?
I'm not religious, but of course, I am in my 60s, and that probably wasn't true when I first went to university aged 18. I was brought up by devout Catholic parents, and I had a great passion for the art and architecture and literature of the Middle Ages. That was probably my first love. And so when I went to university, Australian universities are different to those in the UK, and I think also perhaps to American programs. You may do a particular area, but you can take units in all sorts of other subjects. And so I studied literature, mostly medieval literature, some history, but I ended up sitting in religious studies because it was a newish area at the university at the time, and it was quite a lot smaller and had a really nice vibe. You know, the staff were exceptionally helpful. It was a place where you could feel really happy to work in. And I ended up staying there all the time. I didn't really intend that. When I started at university, I think I was very ignorant. The children of working class parents who've never been to university often are. But I found a home there and I enjoyed the department, and I have been there this year 46 years. So
Amazing.
so obviously it suits me, right?
It's stuck. It's stuck. Well, it's so interesting that you were drawn to that period in time, because one of the things that I'm curious about is the idea of religion being a separate kind of entity from culture or education or law. That wasn't necessarily the case at that point, in at least in the Western world, and perhaps also beyond. And you've integrated literature, history, education, religious studies, that they're all connected in your scholarship. And I'm wondering if that studying that time period especially kind of shaped that integrated scholarly imagination in some way.
Yeah, I think it probably did, actually, because one of the reasons for identifying or being interested in the Middle Ages, of course, is coming from a Catholic background. And I started university in 1981. It was still quite customary in Australia that Catholics and Protestants didn't really socialize very much. This has collapsed quite a lot now in 2026. And of course, there was a tendency of Protestants to consider the Middle Ages as somehow terribly
Yes.
retrograde, you know, something that you wouldn't want to be associated with, that everything came with the arrival of the early
Oh, the
modern
Reformation.
world, so the Reformation, all of that kind of stuff. And I think it's really funny because if you know the discipline of religious studies well, you'll know that there's been a lot of toing and froing, and some of it quite heated in terms of methodological critique that suggests that in some sense religious studies itself is a kind of offshoot of liberal Protestantism. And
Interesting.
I was always really puzzled about this because when I was an ignorant little 18-year-old sitting in my class, I didn't really understand what liberal Protestantism was, and I couldn't really see why it was that important. And in some funny kind of way, I suppose that's been a bit of an advantage for building the kind of career and working on the kind of things that I'm interested in. I kind of always have swum against certain mainstream understandings of the discipline I've lived in for such a long time. I see it really quite differently, I think.
Well, that's, oh, please.
Yeah, well,
Well, it just strikes me so much that one of the ways in which that kind of I don't want to say, well, domination of Protestantism, but at least in our kind of conception of, at least in America, I think certainly it's the case of what religion is essentially anything that looks like Protestantism, because so much of the questions, even in how people historically have been categorized of whether they're religious or not, is, do you believe in God? It's very much about belief, which is so much shaped, of course, by the Reformation, rather than thinking about practices. For example, do you venerate ancestors? Do you, so just thinking about the kind of power within a religious sphere shaping our imagination of what even constitutes religion really strikes me as also being true in your story. So that's fascinating.
yeah, I think that's true. And of course, I ended up leaving my family's Catholicism behind, but I'm comfortable with still thinking of myself as largely culturally a Catholic. That's just how it is. I'm terribly sorry. One of my cats is yowling in the background.
Cat
If
break.
you pick up the name, yes, I'm a cat mother of four. So at some point you might even see one of them. But yeah, I left my familial Catholicism behind, but my late partner and I, he was a really, really militant atheist, and we used to argue about this a little bit when filling in the census for the household, because I used to say I didn't really mind being written down as a Catholic, and he would say, "Well, I'm filling it in, and we're going to be written down as atheists." Uh,
Well, I feel like this conversation kind of sets the groundwork for some of your particular scholarship around invented religions, because filling in that census, that moment when someone is asked, how do you identify religiously? I remember in my youth, I grew up in England, that there was a whole news story about the rise of Jediism, or people writing down that they were part of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. And my interpretation as a schoolboy was that this was kind of a bit of fun. It was poking fun at the dominant Church of England as the national, institution of religion in England, at least. And I'm curious, how were you drawn to this field of invented religions? Because some might say, well, isn't every religion an invented religion? How do we even classify the difference between, something like Jediism and something like the Catholic Church?
This is an excellent question, and you open up immense kind of vistas of possible reflection. When I was an undergraduate, I was taught by Eric Sharp, who had completed his studies in England and who was himself a liberal Protestant. But he had this idea that what's important is not who knows what or that something happened. It's knowing when it happened. Now, when I got interested in so-called invented religions, and I'm happy enough with the term, I'm not sure, absolutely if I were to start now, whether I would use the same term, but it works, it's okay. One of the reasons I didn't begin with every religion is invented is actually because in 2009, when I was writing that book, it wasn't actually that easy to say that. Even if you were, in fact, non-religious and you were working in a secular religious studies department, there's a certain sort of respectfulness about the way we relate to religions. And we used to always say, well, obviously, one of the things about religious studies is it's not theology, and that means questions of truth are not actually what we're interested in.
Right.
We bracket them or we don't consider them. But even when you consider that, it was just not de rigueur to say to anybody, well, of course, it's all absolute nonsense. And everybody is just talking to their imaginary friend. And does it really matter who your imaginary friend is? And I still am not sure that that's a sort of helpful thing to say to anybody. It doesn't really work. So I started with the idea. I liked all of the groups. I knew about them, some of them, really for quite a long time, since I was perhaps an undergraduate. I think Discordianism was the one that I first discovered, was
Mm.
founded in 1957. I probably found it in about 1987. I was 25, and I thought, isn't that interesting? I found a copy of Principia Discordia. I had some students afterwards who were interested. I began teaching in 1984, the year I did my honors, and I became a postgraduate the next year, and I tutored and did various jobbing around the department ever since. And students would often come in and they'd say, well, I'm really interested in this, and I'd say, well, I don't see why you can't do a presentation about that. That's great, that's fine. So when I started off, I thought what I wanted to talk about was religions that didn't say that they'd had some kind of revelation or
Mm.
that there was some, authenticating experience. They basically, the people I wanted to study were the people who said, well, actually, we sat down and we made this up. We were
Mm.
not happy with the religious or spiritual options that we had, and we made up something that we thought worked better, that we thought would make us happier. And I thought, well, no one will get cross with me really if I focus in that way, because I'm not really dissing any other
Right.
religion. I'm just sitting with this particular self-announced category. And if I were going to do it again nowadays, I think I'd pay a lot more attention to the way in which a lot of these groups are like performance art collectives, and
Yes.
they have like a much more performative kind of, and a lot of them live as communes as well. And so, you know, I became quite obsessed with the Sun Ra Orchestra around about 2012. And it just amazed me, the costumes that they wore, the fact that they lived in commune, that Sun Ra had this identity as an extraterrestrial, and it struck me that this was very similar, really, in lots of ways.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's kind of where I got. And the question now, I suppose, about isn't all religion invented? Um, I still think there's a qualified answer there because some of them are a lot more invented than others. This
Mm.
whole idea about, well, I made this up is still a very challenging sort of statement for a lot of people. Whereas somebody who's a spiritual healer or a leader of a small community or something like that, who has recourse to the language of revelation or of vision, is
Mm.
generally seen as far more authentic and valuable.
That strikes me as something, and Amy, I want to come to you in a moment. That sense of what's deemed legitimate or authentic, is it because it comes from you, or is it, are you claiming that it comes from somewhere beyond yourself? Seems to be a really important line in what you're pointing to. I'm also suddenly thinking of the I discovered it maybe last year. I think it's called Creation, an artistic, a woman in Australia who's created these
Yeah,
incredible
absolutely.
costumes and parades, and very much falls into that category of someone who's, claiming like, hey, what we were looking for. And I think she grew up Catholic as well. So there's something about the Catholic imagination at work here. But just the beauty of what she was creating, and the line between, is it religion or is it art? That feels like a really interesting place. So that's really resonating. But Amy, please, I want to hear your question here as well.
Carol, thanks so much. That was so interesting. I'm wondering if we can return back to your comment about focusing on the win and thinking
Mm.
a little bit about the influence of maybe pop culture on these invented religions, maybe the theoretical framework of the sort of everyday practice of religion. If those theories and the kind of culture that was in existence at the moment had any influence on whether or not these invented religions took shape and the shape that they actually took.
Now, that's a great question, but again, I'm actually not sure that the answer is yes. I
Mm.
mean, if you think about the Discordians in the Church of the Subgenius, even if they don't look that way, they're actually very political. And probably the biggest influence on the earlier group of invented religions, and the Church of All Worlds does have a direct pop culture link to Robert A. Heinlein's novel, Stranger in a Strange Land from 1961. But really, I'd say anarchist politics is probably more important to
Mm,
all three of those religions than any particular pop culture manifestation. They all rejected the military, the law, the police,
mm,
wage slavery, sexual restrictions, the idea that you had to wear particular kinds of clothes or get particular kinds of jobs. They were
mm,
kind of, and I mean, when you think that the Discordians start in 57. So they're in that interesting space before the counterculture, but picking up from the beats and having a lot to do with their kind of deal, which also was to drop out, to become bums, to work as dishwashers and bartenders, even if you had degrees or,
mm,
professional qualifications. Why would you box yourself up in that kind of
mm,
community? And so sex was very important. Communal living for lots of people. Church of All Worlds certainly practiced communal living intentionally and often in quite remote and off-grid places where there was also the idea. Environmentalism is
mhm,
another discourse they inherit from the Beats, and there's this idea that you tread lightly on the earth, that you don't pollute, and you don't need material objects, and you don't need money and all of that kind of stuff that everybody tells you that you actually want and need. The answer
mm,
is no, we don't actually. Then there's a big shift with the so-called third millennium invented religions, Jediism, which begins with the Jedi census movement in 2001, Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, which is founded in 2005, various of the others. I mean, Reverend Billy's Church of Stop Shopping is founded in 98, I think, but it doesn't really get going till after the Twin Towers come down. But it is passionately anti-materialistic as well, and it has turned into essentially an eco-faith
mm,
now.
mm.
So again, you've got this situation where they start out with divergent politics, I think, more than anything else. You may love popular culture and want to honor it and venerate it and incorporate it into your practice, but I don't know that it is the sort of linchpin that you need before you can get a religion like this.
It's interesting. I live in New York City, and in November there were posters all around my neighborhood with the By Nothing Day and kind of the Church of what is it called, Billy
Reverend Billy Taylor
Reverend Billy.
and the
Yes,
Church of Stop Shopping.
stopping. Yes, where there was still some of those kind of anti-consumerist worship services popping up. So it lives on. It is interesting though, Carole. The kind of network that we're connected to are people who we've been describing as spiritual innovators, people finding new ways to help people connect with one another, with spiritual practices, with a sense of ancestry or lineage. Is there, and I guess this is a follow-up on Amy's question, are there any patterns that you can see of when there are moments of kind of creativity that happen in the spiritual landscape? Is it in response to, economic downturn? Is it political crisis? Is it institutional collapse? And I don't just mean this in this moment, but as a historian, you're looking back, over centuries. Are there any patterns that you can point to that might help explain this moment that we're in?
Well, if you think about a lot of the heretical movements of the later Middle Ages, they divided into a number of different kinds of protests, but many of them were lay protests against clerical wealth,
Mm, mm,
against the idea. And, you have this whole, the church should be poor. Jesus was poor.
yeah.
The idea that the bishops live in palaces and wear brocade and silk is just obscene, revolting. It's not
Mm,
the right thing. And I think that kind of idea, that people suffer. People live lives of really appalling deprivation.
Mm,
And people who are in power don't really seem to care very much.
mm,
Important. When you think about Reverend Billy and the Church of Stop Shopping, they have moved, like they began very distinctly as a performance collective. You want to talk
mm,
about a moment of creativity. The moments of creativity are always when person A who's got a vision meets person B who's got a vision and they come together. And I mean, in Reverend Billy's case, it's his wife, Savitri D, who was the
mm,
huge inspiration. But if you think about the Discordians, Kerry Thornley and Greg Hill needed each other. They didn't
mm.
do it alone. And the same thing is true with the Church of All Worlds. Um, Tim Zell and Lance Christie were at college together and had already become intimate friends. And they went away, and over spring break, they both read Stranger in a Strange Land, and they came back and said, basically, dude, we have to do this. And that is sort of how a
Yeah,
lot of it gets going. But you need always, I mean, very few of these movements happen because a single person does something. So,
yeah.
when you think about the sociology of new religious movements, the old Stark Bainbridge thing about how there's the entrepreneurial people who start religions, and there's the psychopathological people who start religions, and there's the different model, which is what they call subcultural evolution, which is that you've got to have this groundswell of people who are reading the book or feeling the resistance or unhappy with the world the way it is. And
Mm,
you kind of answered your own question there. The Church of Stop Shopping really kicks off after 9/11,
yeah,
and it's a huge trauma for
yeah.
people in America. And then they grow all the time. And they now own an old bank building in New York. They use it to help undocumented illegal immigrants to work through processes. They feed the poor and the hungry. They
Wow.
find housing for people. They've turned into something that looks a lot more like a so-called real religion, if you like, in a period of nearly 30 years in
Wow.
existence. So, that's interesting. And the fact that they're now really driven by environmental concerns as well is really important. I mean, he used to talk about the shopocalypse, but they
Mm,
talk about the earth apocalypse now.
mm,
And the environmental thing is
yeah,
really totally crucial.
yeah. That's fascinating. I mean, I'm even thinking about how more deemed kind of serious or legitimate new religious movements, even the rise of Methodism as an example, in England, you know, John Wesley never meant to start a new denomination. Like that these things can kind of run away or run ahead of where a founder might start. Someone might have a kind of reform oriented energy at the beginning, but end up, the moment when he starts ordaining people outside of the Anglican institution, that's really when the kind of Methodist movement becomes its own church. And so,
But he still thought that he didn't found a church, and he thought he died an Anglican. Um,
right.
the really important thing for Wesley, which ties in nicely here, is that people wouldn't come to church. So he thought, I'll go to the factories, I'll go to the pubs, I'll go
The
to
world is my parish. Yeah,
I'll go to the
exactly.
brothels, I'll see
Yeah.
who's wherever they are, the
Yeah.
workhouses, and I'll see if I can make people hear me if
Mm,
I go to them.
mm, mm. So it feels like there's something there also about. I love what you were saying, that it was about the collaboration between leaders, or the confluence of new circumstances, new leaders, new times, that leads to often a religious movement that's bigger or different than an individual founder might have envisioned it at the very beginning. Please, Amy.
And I'm also just wondering about our capacity to recognize it as something
Mm,
spiritual or religious, like the broader cultural receptivity and the kind of scholarly frameworks that we have, maybe that being of relevance here too.
Well, look, honestly, I think loads of people don't recognize this stuff as religious or spiritual even now. I mean,
huh.
the the Discordians have been going, heavens, it's 70 years next year. And they're not dying out. They're always going to be small, but it attracts a certain kind of person with certain sort of take on the world, absurd, anarchist,
Mm,
upending conventions kind of person. The Church of All Worlds started in 1962. It's exactly the same age as me, 64 years old.
mm,
And it's not going anywhere hastily. Lance Christie, its co-founder, died some years ago, but it was also very interesting. Christie and Zell had very different, well, actually, they didn't really have different ideas. They had a shared idea, but they took completely different paths.
mm,
Both of them are intellectuals. They both got PhDs, but Zell's interest was religious. He devised rituals.
mm,
His doctorate was in divinity. He kind of
mm,
focused completely on the development of the religion. Um, Christie's doctorate was in environmental science, and he became
oh,
a tree-hugging, river-saving activist. But they
amazing.
saw themselves as having produced the secular and the religious arm of the
Mm,
same movement, which was
mm,
devoted to Gaia, to Earth
mm,
as goddess, the support for the life of all humans, and for humans as participating in the kind of noosphere, the idea that we are the consciousness of this
mm,
planetary goddess.
mm,
And so they did that from a very early point on. The church was probably only about 5 years old, and they already had their paths set ahead. You're going to do this, and I will be doing that, which is really good. Um, the battle to be recognized as a real religion is quite important. I mean, Americans tend to have a bit of a different viewpoint, partly because America's always been seen as peculiarly pro-religion,
mm.
and anybody with their, whatever sum of money that it requires can go into a state
Yes.
department and register something as a religion. And I mean, that's just totally amazing. I grew up in a country where there is no legal definition of a religion. You
Mm,
cannot register a religion. And the only reason, say, Christian churches still have things like tax breaks and all sorts of things that other people just don't have is because of that historical association with the religions of the settler colonialists who came to Australia from 1788 onwards.
mm.
Um, I mean, people often ring me up or they send me emails and they say, look, I'm thinking about this, or I'm part of a very small religion and we'd like to organize to register it. And I write back and say, well, you're on a hiding to nowhere. It's not going to happen. There is no process. We
Yeah.
don't we don't do that kind of thing. But I have another friend who works in Finland,
Mm,
Esimäki, and Finland has a board of experts that
right.
attempt to certify religions. And so new religions come along and they say, well, you've got the Orthodox Church and you've got the Lutherans and you've got the Catholics. Well, we'd like to be registered as a religion. And of course, most of them don't succeed.
Mm,
Even those religions that are actually traditionally religious elsewhere, like Buddhism and Hinduism, struggle enormously, partly because of the bureaucratic paperwork that the Finnish
mm.
registration board requires. And because you said earlier, religion is something that looks like Anglicanism.
Right.
A lot of these things don't look like Anglicanism or Lutheranism or the Orthodox Church. And so the board says, well, you have good intentions and we see exactly what you're kind of getting at. But sorry, um, you're
Not
getting
officially. Yeah.
you're getting a knockback.
Yeah, I remember hearing in divinity school that the only true, at least in, oh, hello, who's this?
This is Venus, who's
Hello,
known
Venus.
known as Empress Crosspatch. She is the boss of the house.
I see it. Yes, she's on her throne right now.
She's on my lap. Let's put her down.
But I remember that joke of really the only true, at least in the United States, as you said, the only definition of religion is, the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, getting to choose who
Yeah.
the tax man gets to define what is religion and what isn't. I want to come back, Carole, to you were pointing to this, one of these new religious movements having both a secular and a sort of religious element. And I want to shift our conversation to another area of your scholarship, which is pilgrimage, because it feels like that practice also sits in an interesting way now in the contemporary world as both a religious practice. You think of the Hajj or, many of these traditional sacred sites that still very intentionally are religious pilgrimages, but also the adaptation of pilgrimage as a language for a more spiritual or even a secular person. And again, coming from a Western European context, I'm thinking of the Camino to Santiago, which, that, as you well know, that the numbers of people who are making that pilgrimage have really blossomed over the last decades. But most people wouldn't identify themselves as Catholic pilgrims. They're navigating, maybe a recent cancer diagnosis or a divorce or the death of a child, or frankly, they just have a sabbatical and they wanted to be outside and, do a long walk. And so as you think about pilgrimage now, what are the boundaries between kind of religious pilgrimage, spiritual tourism, leisure travel? Can pilgrimage be used across those three categories? How do you think about what makes a pilgrimage now?
You take me back. My former PhD student, now colleague at Western Sydney University, Alex Norman, did his PhD on the Camino and also pilgrims in some Indian places, primarily, I think, Dharamsala, but also Benares. So it was one of those immersive doctorates where he walked the Camino and he did a lot of interviewing, and he describes the Camino as a mobile therapist's couch. People go there when they've got
Yes.
something they really need,
Yeah.
some knotty problem they need to
Yeah.
really work through. And as you say, even the sabbatical idea you just floated, it's not so amusing or anything. It's quite real. People
Yeah.
sometimes lose their jobs or they lose their motivation for the job that they still have. And it's
Mm,
like, how do I take myself out of all of this? How do I?
mm,
Well, I think you've raised a question that I still struggle to articulate, but I think is important. Um, People want their lives to have meaning.
mm,
And it's all very well for people to think that things like, I don't know, shopping and having a lot of money and buying cars and, I don't know, having a lot of sex or having, 16 apartments is some kind of meaning making thing. But actually, most people find that pretty
mm,
hollow. And if we look at the way that touristic studies and pilgrimage studies come together, probably the most important person is Eric Cohen, who
mm,
was in the 70s. And he said basically that there were 5 different kinds of tourist. And the first two, recreational and diversionary, I think he called them, they're just people who they're from place A, they're identified with place A, they go to place B for a diversion,
mm,
for holiday, to be refreshed, to feel better, to feel different. But he said that basically what came after that were people who increasingly were less attached to their own way of life and their own
mm,
reality and who wanted to encounter the other.
mm,
And these, he called them experiential tourists, experimental tourists, and the final one he called the existential tourist. And he says
mm.
existential tourists, they're not actually identified in any sense with a home base. They're
Ah,
out there in the world, encountering, experiencing, absorbing, feeling. And
mm,
when you think about it, you know, we do have stories in history of pilgrims who never went home. They
Hmm.
started on a pilgrimage route and they just kept walking. And in Japan, for example, during economic periods of downturn, the Shikoku Henro on the island of Shikoku, 88 shrines, a circular route. Often people who lost their jobs became permanent pilgrims. And when they were interviewed by people like Ian Reader, who's done a lot of work on this sort of stuff, they often said they weren't religious, but
Mm,
having lost their role, lost their function, lost their
mm,
purpose in life, what could they become? One of the things they could become was they would
wow.
put on the white robe and the hat and the staff, and they would walk the henro. They would sleep overnight in the shrines, be fed by the monks on the way, and
Mm,
just you need never go home, you know?
wow.
So we all know something about traveling changes our world. Even a week away at somewhere
Mm,
where you used to go when you were a kid with your parents can offer you an amazing refreshment and something of a reset. But
mm,
there are other people whose inner conditions make them approach traveling in a different kind of way,
mm,
and the impact that it can have is much more seismic.
mm,
You know, Carol, one of the things I was thinking about as I was surveying your really prolific writings was this kind of through line between the invented religion and the pilgrimage to the genuine fakes. But
mm,
now, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that the through line is really people trying to, you said, take myself out of this, right?
mm.
Like it seems like both of these are kind of agentic resistance efforts. And I wonder if that's how you see the through line or if that's not
Okay.
even necessary.
No, I think that's a really good point. And I was going to say, when I started off with the Middle Ages, it's really difficult. What makes something a preferred other world
Right.
for a person? There are lots of people who like dressing up in medieval costume and fighting out. We've got two medieval fairs coming up in Sydney very soon. And I often go partly because I want to do some sort of field work. My sister and I next month are going to the Australian Celtic Festival
Mm,
because this year it's on Scotland, which is sort of my second
mm,
home because of my relationship with Edinburgh University. And there are people who aren't Scottish, but they feel Scottish.
right.
And
Right.
there are people who aren't medieval because heavens, we all live in the 21st century, but they feel
Yeah.
medieval. But
Yeah.
if you look at the university and you see the um, students in the classics department, they might find ancient Rome or ancient Greece more compelling. But
Hmm.
everybody's got some kind of place where they go out from the place where they
Hmm.
are now and they go into and there's this question about authenticity. It's a big word, and a lot of scholars get kind of they choke on it and they start saying it makes me vomit. I hate it. What does it even mean? I don't feel like that. I'm okay with the idea. I think if somebody says to you when you're talking to them about an experience, it feels authentic to me, that you
Mm,
can't really get much further than that. I mean, obviously, if we're talking about something that's got moral dimensions, somebody who says, well, being a cannibal feels authentic to me, I'm probably likely not to go along with it. But if somebody says, I like
mm,
I'm part of, the White Rose or the Sealed Knot, which are, English Civil War cosplay groups, and I dress up and I've
mm,
got a musket. I mean, we all have these flintlock muskets that everybody was using, and we do war games, but we also have feasts, and our girlfriends wear fabulous gowns and things like that. And I say, well, if that's the thing that makes your life feel authentic, well, I don't really see you're doing any
Mm,
particularly harmful thing. And so when you think about the travel, pilgrimage, tourism thing, it's similar. It all it all comes from an idea somehow that the workday life that we have is inauthentic. It's somehow not where we could be our true self. And people think, well, how can I be my true self? Some people would say it's a question of faith. Some people would say it's a question of orienting towards the things you love. It may be art, it may be
mm,
music, it may be sport. I've done a lot of work on sport.
hmm.
Would
Yeah.
never have thought that I would, honestly. Sometimes you have a career shift, something happens, and it's just because really somebody sends you an email. Vince Biondo sent me an email and he said, I need a chapter in a book that I'm writing about religion in everyday life. That goes back to your point, Amy. You said earlier this lived idea. He
Hmm.
said, do you think you could write something about sport? And I thought, God, I'm the last person. But I thought, oh, I don't know. Yeah, I could have a go. I blame Victor Turner. I don't know
Mm,
how much Turner you've
hmm.
read, but in the ritual process, he turned Arnold van Gennep inside out because the
Mm,
whole idea about the where you are in your kind of home place and then the liminal phase and then reintegration with his ideas about structure and anti-structure, Turner
mm,
argued that actually inauthenticity and sort of nothing was our everyday life. And it was liminality that was
mm.
filled with this amazing potential to be someone different, to experience all sorts of things that you wouldn't experience otherwise. And before that, the idea was, well, actually, it's your home life that's your real you. But
Right.
you have like a little adventure, or you have an initiation, or you have a change status, you get married, you go through a bar mitzvah, or, whatever it is. And then you're integrated back into your community and you're different, but actually, your community is always where you want to be. And Turner said, no.
Mm,
He didn't see
mm,
that. He thought it was the open space, the space of fluctuating, unfixed
mm. That's where
liminality,
the
where we are real. And that's why
mm,
you're more real when you're on holiday than you are when you're in the office, and you're more real when you're in your 17th century gown than when you're wearing your Keith Haring t-shirt. This is the whole thing.
yeah,
And this is so interesting because people nowadays, it is a personal choice. Some people like the Middle Ages more. Some people like dressing up as elves in Tolkien, and some people, but it's lots and lots of people cosplay fan conventions. I've increasingly become quite
absolutely.
because they're this alternate community where really serious play goes on. Um, but people make elective choices. And so we take ourselves back really to the Enlightenment. And I've become more interested in Goethe over the
Mm,
years. He's the man who says, your parents don't matter, your family don't matter. What matters is elective affinity. Who are the
mm,
people who are
mm,
doing the thing that you're doing, who ratify you, whom you love, whom you would choose?
mm.
And a lot of people in 2026, that's their entire life.
Well, I think about even something like the explosion of drag and kind of especially drag race, but the drag conventions where people meet the queens, but also get into glam themselves, and that being another world, or the impact of Black Panther on the kind of Black American imagination as this place of meaning, and a whole set of kind of symbols and language to create that meaningful place. I want to stay with pilgrimage for one moment, Carole, and this will be my final question. Um, Again, in the UK, I'm familiar with an organization called the British Pilgrimage Trust, which was a new creation to kind of reopen some of the traditional walkways that were, abolished with the dissolution of the monasteries and Henry VIII's creation of the Anglican Church. And I think it relates to what you're saying about Turner in the sense that we are more real when we are out in that liminal space, when you're walking, that path, when you're maybe more connected to the elements, more connected to history, more connected to your kind of your animal self, the primal needs of food and water and sleep, but also because the speed at which you're moving is somehow more human. And so I'm curious if there's anything particular about walking that is essential to pilgrimage, or at least moving at a human speed rather than flying or driving or being in a train. Is there anything that's come up in your scholarship about the significance of walking in particular?
The most important article on this is by a guy called Sean Slavin, and he talks about how walking is itself a ritual activity, whether you think about it or not. I think that's a really important thing. It's a fairly simple article, but it's really, really good. And of course, if you are interested in Japanese culture, there's a thing called kinhin, walking meditation, which is quite different to sitting meditation, which is zazen, which most people are more familiar with. But that whole thing about reopening the old pilgrim routes, you probably know Marion Bowman's work. She's done loads of really interesting things on the pilgrim routes in the UK. My late partner was British. He grew up in Stevenage in Hertfordshire. And we, for a glorious period of about a decade, walked. We started in 2005. We walked the Hadrian's Wall Way, the St. Cuthbert Way, the Walsingham Way, the Yorkshire Wolds Way,
Yes.
the Ridge Way, the Cotswold Way, the Cumbria Way, all of it. I've got so many guidebooks, and of course it feels to me like I probably will never do it again because it's a good thing to have a companion. I'm not sure I would want to do it alone. I'm 5'2" and I'm now an old lady, but it was tremendously important to us to do that, and we had amazing experiences, and a lot of the things that I have recorded and not just the long walks, because also going to see monuments like the Rolling Stones or things like that. Donald was always there with me, and we did these things together, and they seem very important. I was very glad that I had that option. He died in 2021 of pneumonia, aged 52. He was a lot younger than I was. And that was like a terrible life transforming event. But Amy mentioned earlier the idea of the genuine fake, and that grows up in tourism studies. The guy who invents that, David Brown, he's thinking about things like, and I did this 2 years ago and I was really interested. He's thinking about things like going to Lascaux 4, which is not the Lascaux caves, but is like an imitation.
Replica, right.
Yeah, because you can't go to the real thing. And it was so interesting. After I went in 2024, I talked to my late partner's aunt who lives here in Sydney, and I go to see her twice a week. She's 96. She saw the real Lascaux.
Wow.
And then she saw Lascaux 2, the first copy of it, and said, well, it was utterly shit, really. Wasn't anything like, and I said, well, this is now so totally amazing that I'm not sure if I would know the difference if I were in the real place or not. And David Brown, who came up with this genuine fake idea, he says it's relational. It's the person encountering the place, and the person has to be able to receive the place as authentic and real. Not just a place sort of be plausible in. And so that's really interesting. And I've become obsessed with fake stone circles because I have always been obsessed with megaliths. I love the Neolithic. And of course, it's really difficult. You grow up in Australia, there are no Neolithic monuments. It doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But actually there are. We've got a copy of Stonehenge. We've got a copy of the Ring of Brodgar. There's a Stonehenge near Wellington in New Zealand. There is a Stonehenge at Maryhill in Washington, which the Church of All Worlds used for amazing rituals, because they just hired the monument and did. because they wanted to. And they said basically that the fake monument became the real monument. As they went back in time in their imagination, they became the pagans of the Neolithic celebrating, and the fake circle became real, and they joined their past, their ancestors, in this kind of extraordinary experience. And, you know, I haven't seen the Australian standing stones since 1995, and this is the festival my sister and I are going to, the Australian Celtic Festival. All I really want to do, actually, I don't care. I mean, I'll look at the caber tossing and eat shortbread and drink whiskey and all that. But what I really want to do is I want to walk in the stone again. I remember the first time I did it, I couldn't believe it. I thought, my head, we've got this here in our little colonial outpost, you know. It's so amazing. And, you know, they're all over the place. Even in the UK, which has so many beautiful and authentic circles, the Sight Hill stones in Glasgow are a replica, a genuine fake made in 1979.
Wow.
They are astonishing, amazing. I feel like it's real when I'm there.
Yeah. And that's really all that matters in a way. Carole, I'm conscious of time, so I want to just offer my huge thanks for your time here with us today, but also just for your decades of scholarship and teaching. It's really extraordinary to be able to jump from so many different historical contexts and religious movements and kind of bind these threads together. So I hope this will be stimulating and a helpful reflection for our viewers when they get a chance to listen in on this conversation. And just deep thanks and gratitude for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carole.
It's 1 a.m.
Yes, go to bed. Go to bed. Thank you again. So grateful for you. Bye-bye.